It seems like you can't go anywhere these days without seeing tablets in schools.
Yeah.
They're just everywhere. And there's a big push from policymakers to get them into classrooms, like from kindergarten right through high school.
Mm-hmm.
It really makes you wonder what's going through the students' minds about all this tech being integrated into their learning.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what we're going to be focusing on today in this deep dive. We've been looking at some fascinating research. 41 different studies, actually, all focused on students' perceptions of using tablets for learning in both primary and secondary schools.
41 studies, that's a lot.
It is, it is. These studies were conducted between 2000 and 2018, so it gives us a pretty good span of time to see how things have been evolving.
So just to be clear for our listeners, a lot of the research we've seen in the past has looked at whether tablets actually help students learn better.
Exactly, yeah.
But today, we're kind of flipping the script a bit. Our mission is to really understand how students view tablets as learning tools. What are their perceptions? What do they like? What don't they like?
Right.
And what shapes those opinions? Because ultimately, those perceptions are going to be crucial for how tablets are adopted and how much value they actually bring to education.
Precisely. I mean, you could have the most amazing cutting-edge technology in the world, but if students don't see it as useful or if they find it difficult to use, they're not going to embrace it, and then all that potential is kind of wasted.
Makes sense. So let's jump right in. Across all these 41 studies, what's the overall takeaway about how students feel about using tablets? Is it a thumbs up, thumbs down, somewhere in between?
Well, the big headline finding is that generally students have rather good perceptions of tablet use for learning.
Okay, so generally positive.
Yeah. It's not like a universal love fest, but the overall feeling is positive. But, and this is where it gets interesting, when you start to look at the qualitative studies, the ones that really delved into students' experiences through interviews and open-ended questions, a more nuanced picture starts to emerge. You see some limitations to that overall positive view.
So it's not as simple, all kids love all tablets all the time kind of story.
Not quite, no.
I guess that makes sense. It'd be pretty surprising if it were that straightforward. So it sounds like we have the studies with surveys and numbers giving us the broad strokes, the general positive feelings, but then the deeper conversations, the qualitative stuff that gives us the details, the specific things that maybe aren't so rosy.
Exactly. The quantitative studies with all the hard numbers, they give us the trends, the statistical significance. But the qualitative research, that's where we really get those rich insights into why students feel the way they do and what specific challenges they might be facing. They really complement each other.
Absolutely. They give us that full picture. Now, how did the researchers go about figuring out what these perceptions were? Were there any kind of frameworks or models they were using to understand how students were thinking about tablets?
Yeah, so about a dozen of the studies use specific models that come from social psychology. They're basically frameworks for understanding how people adopt and use technologies. You might have heard of some of them, things like TAM, which stands for the Technology Acceptance Model, or TPB, the Theory of Planned Behavior. And then there's UTEPU, the Unified Theory of Acceptance and Use of Technology.
Okay, I have to admit, those sound a little textbooky.
I know, right?
Can you break it down for us a bit? What are these models actually trying to tell us about how students approach tablets?
Sure. Basically, all these models are trying to get at the same core question. Why would a student choose to use a tablet for learning?
Okay.
They're looking at factors like, does the student think the tablet will actually help them learn? That's their attitude towards it. Do they think their teachers or their friends expect them to use it? That's the social pressure part.
Yeah.
And do they feel confident that they can figure out how to use the tablet effectively? That's about perceived control and ease of use.
Okay, I see. So in a nutshell, we're talking about, do they think it's useful?
Yes.
Do they feel pressure to use it? And do they feel like they can handle it?
Exactly. Those are the key questions.
Makes sense.
But it's important to point out that the majority of the studies, the other 29, didn't use those specific models.
Okay.
They took a more descriptive approach, just exploring students' experiences and perceptions without trying to fit them into those predetermined categories.
So a mix of seeing if the theories fit and just observing what's actually happening.
Exactly.
That makes sense. So let's talk methods. How did these researchers actually study these perceptions? What were they doing to gather this information?
Well, there was a pretty good mix of approaches, quantitative, qualitative, and sometimes a combination of both mixed methods.
Okay.
The quantitative studies, they mainly relied on surveys, with set questions and rating scales, which allowed them to do statistical analysis and look for patterns across groups of students.
Hmm.
Then the qualitative studies, those use things like in-depth interviews, open-ended questions on surveys, or a combination of both. This allowed researchers to really get a deeper understanding of students' perspectives in their own words, the hows and whys behind their feelings.
Makes sense. And how many students were actually involved in these studies? Were we talking about small groups, larger groups? Give us a sense of the scale.
Yeah, so the number of participants varied quite a bit across the studies.
Yeah.
Some involved fewer than 30 students, which allowed for a lot of detail and depth from those smaller groups, while others had hundreds, even over 1,000 participants in a couple of cases, giving a much broader snapshot of perceptions.
Right, so you have that trade-off. The small groups give you the richness, but the large groups can show you how widespread certain opinions might be.
Exactly.
So even within those studies that were using those acceptance models we talked about earlier, were they all measuring the same things in the same way?
Well, that's one of the challenges when you're looking at a big body of research like this. The review pointed out that even when studies were based on the same model, like TAM, for example, they often use different questionnaires and scales to measure the same concept. So, one study might be measuring perceived usefulness with one set of questions, and another study might be measuring the same thing with a completely different set of questions.
Ah, so it's kind of like trying to compare apples and oranges, even though they're both fruit.
In a way, yeah. It makes it tricky to directly compare findings across studies because you're not always sure if they're measuring things in exactly the same way.
Right, so everyone's kind of speaking the same language, but with slightly different dialects. Now, were there any studies that stood out in terms of how they went about understanding student perceptions, maybe some particularly creative or unique methods?
Yeah, definitely. A couple of studies really caught my eye because of their innovative approaches. One, for example, asked students a very simple but profound question: what is learning? And then they analyzed whether tablets were spontaneously mentioned by students as part of their definition of learning.
Oh, I see.
It was a really clever way to gauge how much tablets were already integrated into students' understanding of what learning means to them. If tablets didn't even come up when they were defining learning, that tells you something right there.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. It's not just asking, do you like tablets? It's getting at something much deeper. Are they even part of their mental model of what learning is? What was the other interesting approach you mentioned?
Another study had students write advisory letters, one to a new student coming into the school and one to a new teacher.
Okay.
And the idea was for the students to give advice on how to use tablets effectively for learning and teaching.
Interesting.
These letters ended up being really valuable sources of information because the advice students gave revealed a lot about their perceptions of tablets, both the positives and the negative.
Oh, that's smart. You're getting their honest opinions without them feeling like they're being tested or evaluated. It's just
Yeah.
genuine advice.
Exactly.
Now, let's shift gears a bit and talk about the context of these studies. Was the way tablets were being used pretty much the same across the board? Or was there a lot of variation in how they were being integrated into the classroom?
Yeah, there was definitely quite a bit of variety, and I think that's an important thing to consider. The majority of the studies, 31 out of 41, didn't have strict controls on how students were using the tablets or how often.
Okay.
Some of them focused on general tablet use across different subjects, especially in secondary school. So it was more like, okay, you've been using tablets in school. What are your overall impressions?
So kind of a big picture view of their experience.
Yeah, pretty much. But some studies did get more specific. They focused on students' perceptions after using particular apps or for certain types of tasks.
Okay.
Like, how did you feel about using the tablet for group work versus individual work,
Yeah.
or for reading digital texts versus taking notes? We even saw a few studies that looked at very specific controlled learning activities on the tablets.
Got it. So range from general impressions to very specific use cases. And how long had students been using tablets before their perceptions were measured? Did that seem to make a difference?
Well, the time frame varied significantly. Some studies gathered perceptions after a single short task on the tablet, while others looked at students who had been using tablets regularly for over a year.
A pretty big difference there.
Huge, yeah. And it's important to think about because someone who's brand new to tablets might have very different initial impressions compared to someone who's been using them for a long time and has had a chance to experience both the benefits and the drawbacks.
Absolutely. You would imagine that initial excitement excitement might fade a bit if they run into technical difficulties or if they start to feel like the tablets aren't as useful as they thought.
Right.
Were most of these studies just like one-time snapshots, or did they follow students over a longer period to see how those perceptions might evolve?
The vast majority, 37 out of the 41 studies, were cross-sectional, which means they only collected data at a single point in time. That gives us a snapshot, how they felt at that particular moment, but it doesn't show us how those perceptions might change over time.
Right.
There were a few, though, that did use a longitudinal design, which means they collected data at multiple points, which allows us to see how those perceptions developed over weeks, months, even years in one case.
I bet that's really insightful.
Oh, definitely. To see if those initial impressions hold up or if they shift significantly with more experience. One last thing about the context, I think it's worth noting the type of tablets that were used, because that can play a role as well.
Yeah, good point. So was it mostly iPads, Android tablets, a mix?
Well, the review found that iPads were the most common type used. They were in 28 out of the 41 studies.
Okay.
8 of the studies used Android tablets. But interestingly, a significant number of them, 26 of the studies, didn't actually specify the brand or type of tablet.
Interesting. Maybe they were looking at larger groups of students across multiple schools and didn't have that level of detail.
That's possible, yeah.
Okay, so we've got a good overview of the different ways these perceptions were studied, the context in which they were studied. Now let's get to the heart of the matter. Let's talk about those perceptions themselves. What did students actually say? Let's start with how useful they thought tablets were for learning that performance expectancy idea we talked about earlier.
Yeah, so the studies that used those social psychology models, they generally found moderate to high levels of agreement when it came to performance expectancy,
Okay.
meaning students felt that tablets could be helpful for their education, they saw potential in them.
So they weren't dismissing them outright. They felt like, yeah, these could actually be useful for me.
Right, that was the general sense.
What did the qualitative studies add to that picture? What specifically did they see as beneficial?
Well, the qualitative findings really fleshed out those quantitative ratings. Students talked about how tablets could make their courses richer, more engaging, and just more enjoyable overall.
Okay. Okay.
They felt like tablets could help them learn and understand things better, keep their schoolwork more organized, and work more efficiently.
Mm-hmm.
Some students really liked the personalization aspect, that tablets could tailor their learning experience to their individual needs.
Yeah.
And they also appreciated the immediate feedback that some apps and programs could provide. So definitely some enthusiasm there.
Yeah, it sounds like they were picking up on the potential for a more interactive and engaging learning experience.
Definitely.
But you mentioned earlier that there were some limitations to that positive view.
Right.
What were some of the drawbacks or concerns that students brought up about the usefulness of tablets?
Well, one of the biggest concerns, not surprisingly, was distraction.
Mm-hmm.
The temptation to use tablets for things other than schoolwork, games, social media, all that.
Makes sense. Basically, mini entertainment center right there in their hands.
Exactly. And it can be a real challenge for students to stay focused. Another issue that came up frequently was a lack of content and tasks specifically designed for tablets.
Oh, that's interesting.
Students often felt like they were just doing the same old worksheets and activities, but on a screen instead of paper, and it felt kind of pointless.
Right, like the technology wasn't actually adding anything to the learning experience.
Exactly. It was just a different format, but not necessarily a better one. And in one study, almost half of the students said they felt like the tasks they were given were just artificial uses of the tablet, not really taking advantage of what it could do.
That's a pretty big red flag.
Yeah.
What about the communication aspect?
Yeah.
How did students feel about using tablets to connect with their teachers and classmates?
There were mixed opinions on that.
Oh.
Some students felt that tablets opened up new ways to communicate, share information, collaborate on projects, all positive.
Mm-hmm.
But then others said that tablets actually had a negative impact on social interaction,
Mm-hmm.
that it led to less face-to-face communication because everyone was glued to their screens.
Yeah, that's a valid point. It's something we see even outside of school.
Absolutely.
Everyone's on their phones, less engaged with the people right in front of them. Were there any other downsides to the perceived usefulness of tablets?
Yeah, some students mentioned frustration with restrictions that schools put on the tablets,
Okay.
like blocking certain apps or websites.
Mm.
They felt like it limited the potential of the tablets and made them feel more like a controlled device than a versatile tool for learning.
Makes sense. All right, so we've talked about usefulness.
Mm.
Now, what about effort expectancy? That ease of use factor.
Hmm.
Did students generally find tablets easy to use?
Yeah, for the most part. The research consistently showed that students didn't perceive a lot of difficulty in using tablets.
So they weren't intimidated by the technology.
No, not generally.
What specifically did they find easy?
They said things like, tablets were easy to read on, easy to communicate with, easy to share and manage files.
Okay.
They also liked how easy it was to find information and resources online. So the basic functions seemed pretty intuitive for them.
So no problem with the basic stuff.
Hmm.
But were there any areas where they did struggle or find tablets difficult to use?
Definitely. Writing on tablets was a big one,
Yeah, I can imagine.
especially using those on-screen keyboards.
Right.
A lot of students still preferred good old-fashioned pen and paper or even an external keyboard if they had a lot of writing to do.
It's just not the same, is it?
No.
You don't get that same tactile feedback.
Exactly. Another frustration was technical problems.
Of course.
Things like apps crashing, tablets freezing up,
Yeah,
those kinds of glitches.
that's got to be frustrating.
Oh, incredibly. It can really disrupt the flow of learning. And it could happen for all sorts of reasons, too. Software updates, bad Wi-Fi, sometimes even just user error.
Of course, yeah. It's never just one thing.
Never. And then there's the ever-present issue of battery life.
Oh, yeah, that's a classic.
Running out of juice in the middle of class, that's never fun.
No, not at all. So definitely some hurdles there.
Mm-hmm.
Were there any physical downsides to using tablets that students mentioned?
Yeah, some secondary school students reported experiencing eye strain and headaches from prolonged tablet use.
Makes sense. Looking at a screen all day can't be good for you.
Right. But on the plus side, many students were happy to not have to lug around heavy textbooks anymore.
Yeah, that's a definite win.
They saw that as a big advantage in terms of physical effort.
Okay, so some pluses and minuses on the physical side.
Mm-hmm.
What about their overall attitude towards tablets? We talked about usefulness, ease of use, but overall, did they like using them? How do they feel about them in general?
Well, even with those challenges we just discussed, the research suggests that overall, students tend to have positive attitudes and perceptions towards tablets. They seem to be becoming more integrated into the school culture, and students are generally embracing them as a tool for learning.
So that initial finding of rather good perceptions, it seems to hold up. Now, we've talked about what those perceptions are, but what factors seem to influence them? What makes one student have a more positive view of tablets while another student might be less enthusiastic?
Right. The research pointed to a few key factors. When it comes to performance expectancy and effort expectancy, so how useful and how easy to use they think the tablets are, things like gender and grade level, didn't show consistent patterns. Some studies found girls had slightly more positive views, others found it was boys, and many found no real difference based on those demographics.
Interesting.
One thing that did seem to matter, though, was self-efficacy, basically. A student's belief in their own ability to use technology.
That makes sense. If you feel confident using something, you're probably going to have a more positive attitude towards it.
Exactly. On the flip side, anxiety about technology had a negative effect on effort expectancy, how easy they found tablets to use.
Okay, so confidence is key. What about the actual subject matter they were learning? Did that play a role in how they perceived the tablets?
Yeah, it seemed to. Some students, for example, still preferred paper and pencil for subjects like math, maybe for working through problems or showing their work step by step.
Yeah, I can see that.
But those same students might find tablets really useful for subjects like history or geography, where they could access digital resources, maps, multimedia content, all that.
Right. It's about finding the right tool for the job. So it's not a one-size-fits-all situation.
Exactly. Now, shifting to attitude and general perceptions, their overall feelings about tablets, well, it's not surprising that if students found tablets useful and easy to use, they tended to have a more positive attitude towards them.
Right. Makes sense.
Interestingly, the social influence factor, whether they felt pressure from their peers or teachers to use tablets, wasn't always a strong predictor of their attitude.
Oh, interesting. You'd think that would be a bigger deal.
You would, but it seems like students are forming their own opinions based on their own experiences. One thing that did consistently emerge as a strong predictor of a positive attitude over time was perceived enjoyment.
So if they're having fun using them, they're going to like them more. Seems pretty straightforward.
Yep. And if they had a positive attitude about tablets even before they started using them regularly, that seemed to lead to a stronger sense of control over their use later on.
Okay, so going in with a good mindset can actually set them up for success.
It seems that way. Now, this is where it gets a little tricky. prior experience. You'd think the more experience students have with tablets, the more positive their perceptions would be, right?
Yeah, that's what I would assume.
Well, the research wasn't totally clear-cut on that.
Oh,
Some studies found that more experience did lead to more positive views, but others found that initial positive feelings could actually decrease over time.
really? Why would that be?
Well, maybe it's because they start to encounter those technical glitches we talked about earlier, or maybe the novelty just wears off after a while. One study found no significant change in student perceptions over 2 years of tablet use.
Wow, so it's not just about giving them more time with the technology.
It seems like there's more to it than that. Another interesting finding was that younger students tended to have a more positive initial attitude towards tablets compared to older students.
Hmm. Maybe they're just more open to new technology, or maybe they haven't had as many negative experiences with it yet.
Could be. And the gender effect on attitude, that wasn't consistent either. Sometimes girls were more positive, sometimes boys were, sometimes no difference. It really depended on the study.
So, a lot of variability there. What about the way tablets were actually being used in the classroom? Did the teacher's role or how learning activities were structured make a difference in students' perceptions?
Oh, absolutely. Hugely important. The teacher's skill in integrating tablets effectively was a major factor. When teachers provided clear guidance, structured activities, and made sure the tablet use was purposeful, students had much more positive experiences.
Makes sense. You need that teacher buy-in.
Definitely. If students felt like the tablets were just being used for the sake of using technology, they weren't as enthusiastic.
Right. It can't just be technology for technology's sake.
Exactly. And this is interesting. Students who were more self-directed learners, more independent, they tended to have more positive attitudes towards using tablets.
Hmm. I wonder if it's because they felt more in control of their learning when they were using the tablet.
Could be, yeah. And when it came to collaborative work, students much preferred having one tablet per student rather than sharing a single tablet with a group.
Yeah, one-to-one makes sense. You can actually work together more effectively that way. Okay, so we've talked a lot about what shapes perceptions, but how do those perceptions actually translate into how students use tablets?
Well, those social psychology models we talked about earlier, they propose that our perceptions influence our intentions, which then influence our actual behavior. And some of the studies did look at these connections specifically with tablets in schools.
And what do they find?
They found that having a positive attitude towards tablets could initially predict whether students intended to use them, but that link could weaken over time.
Interesting. So the initial enthusiasm might fade if the experience doesn't live up to expectations.
Perhaps. But performance expectancy. So whether students felt the tablets were useful for learning, that was a strong and consistent predictor of both intention to use and actual use for learning tasks, though not as much for communication.
So if they see it as a good tool for learning, they're more likely to use it for learning. What about ease of use? Did that have a direct impact on how much they actually use the tablets?
One study actually found that there wasn't a direct link between perceived ease of use and actual use.
Huh, that's surprising.
Yeah. However, that feeling of empowerment in learning, so the belief that the tablet was helping them become better learners, that did predict both how much they use tablets for learning and for communication.
Ah, so it's not just about being easy to use, it's about feeling like it's actually making a difference in their learning.
Exactly. It's about the value they perceive.
What other factors played a role in predicting tablet use?
Well, social influence, that's whether they felt pressure from their peers or teachers to use tablets, did positively predict both intentions and actual use, particularly in the early stages of tablet adoption.
So what others think does matter, at least initially.
It seems so. And self-efficacy, that confidence in their own tech skills, could also influence their intention to use tablets, and this effect might vary depending on how familiar they were with the technology.
Okay. Anything else?
Yeah, the affective factor, basically how students felt about tablets emotionally, their positive or negative feelings, that predicted how much they use tablets for communication, but not for learning tasks.
Interesting.
And gender could sometimes moderate the relationship between perceptions and use. For example, one study found that girls were more likely to use tablets for homework and to communicate with teachers.
So it's a pretty complex web of factors all interacting
Hmm.
to influence how students engage with tablets. Now, this research has some pretty big implications for educators and policymakers, right?
Absolutely. I think there are some key takeaways here.
What would you say are the most important ones?
Well, first, it seems that tablets might be better suited for certain types of tasks than others. They're great for viewing and sharing information, recording audio and video, and communicating.
Right.
But for tasks that require a lot of writing, especially with those virtual keyboards, they might not be ideal, at least not in their current form.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Second, and this can't be emphasized enough, the teacher's role is absolutely crucial.
Hmm.
Their skills, their training, how they integrate tablets into their teaching at all has a huge impact on students' experiences and perceptions.
So it's not just about handing out tablets, it's about professional development, support for teachers.
Exactly. We also need to be mindful of the potential for visual fatigue with prolonged tablet use.
Yeah, that's a valid concern.
And finally, I think we need to be really thoughtful about how we design learning activities and resources specifically for tablets, making sure they're actually enhancing the learning process and not just replicating traditional methods in a digital format.
Right, it's got to be more than just worksheets on a screen. Those are all really important points.
Hmm.
Now, this review looked at studies up to 2018. What were some of the limitations of that research? What areas do we still need to explore further?
Well, one of the biggest limitations was the lack of consistency across studies. They were using different theoretical frameworks, different measurement tools. It makes it hard to compare findings and draw strong conclusions across the board.
Right, it's like trying to put together a puzzle when all the pieces are from different puzzles.
Exactly. Another limitation was that many studies were descriptive, just reporting what students said, but not really digging into the why behind those perceptions and how they actually affected learning outcomes. We need more research that specifically looks at that connection between tablet use, student perceptions, and actual learning results.
So, connecting those dots more explicitly.
Yes. Many studies also didn't focus on specific learning tasks or contexts. It was more general tablet use.
Okay.
And there was also a tendency in some of the research to focus more on the technology itself than on the pedagogical aspects, how it was being used to support teaching and learning. So I think future research needs to delve deeper into those pedagogical aspects, integrate theories of motivation and learning more fully, do more long-term studies to see how perceptions evolve over time, and look at how students are using tablets outside of the classroom as well.
So, a lot more to learn, a lot more to explore.
Definitely.
As we wrap up our deep dive today, what's the big takeaway message you want our listeners to walk away with?
I think the core message is this. Students' perceptions of using tablets for learning are complex.
Yeah.
They're generally positive, but it's not a simple, hey, everyone loves tablets kind of story. Those feelings are shaped by a whole bunch of different factors, the specific task they're doing, how their teacher's using the technology, the technical aspects, the social context, it's all intertwined.
And understanding those nuances, those complexities is crucial if we want to make the most of tablets in education.
Absolutely. It's not just about providing the technology, it's about creating the right conditions for it to be successful, both in terms of how it's used and how it's perceived.
Really good points to end on. It makes you think about your own experiences with technology and learning, or maybe the experiences of students you know.
Hmm.
What parts of this research resonated with you? What surprised you? And what new questions do you have about the role of tablets in education moving forward? It's a conversation that's definitely going to continue.
For sure.
Thanks so much for this deep dive today. It's been really illuminating.
My pleasure.